Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Good morning. Issan used to say, in case of emergency. The talk I'd like to give this morning is based on a chapter in Winston's new anthology called Queer Dharma 2. I haven't seen the book yet. What chapter am I?
I covered something today with me the beginning, towards the beginning.
Toward the beginning, okay. One of the things that I've been thinking about in recent years is that many of the Buddhist groups, at least the ones I've been around, have kind of missed the boat on the essentials of Buddhism. We get very enamored of enlightenment and of meditation as our way of waiting for enlightenment. And this is true of many Buddhist sanghas as they've come to develop in the United States. And one of the things we forgot that has gotten us in trouble is the very core teachings of the Buddha, the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. Stephen Batchelor's book, which is about a year old, called Buddhism Without Beliefs, makes the point that the Buddha's teaching, the Four Noble Truths, are not a doctrine that we need to believe, but they are rather four elements of an experience that we need to go through. And of course, the Four Noble Truths, there's suffering, there's an origin of suffering, there's a way out of suffering. That way out is the Eightfold Path. In Dharma talks you'll hear around many sanghas, you won't hear much mention of either of those numbers, 4 or 8. And I think there needs to be a closer look at all that. And that's why I picked one of the 8, right speech, as the subject for a chapter in Queer Dharma 2. I've been looking at right speech for the last few years as a way of practicing. And I must tell you that it's a very difficult practice. It's worse than doing a one-day sitting. It's very difficult. Buddhist psychology splits things into 3. It splits things into all kinds of numbers, but experience into thought, behavior, and speech. So right speech is one very crucial element in our lives, in everyone's lives. One thing that got my attention was that, if you look at the monotheisms, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the only speech thing, there are 2 speech things. One is no swearing, and the other is no lying. In the Buddhist precepts, the 5 precepts that are shared among all Buddhist groups, killing, stealing, lying, intoxicant sex, those are shared by all lineages, monks and nuns, and lay people. But there's also the 10 precepts. There were 5 more added later on during the Mahayana development. And 3 of those 5 concern themselves with speech. So not just not lying, but also no praising the self and disparaging others. Oh God, I'm blanking out.
No gossip.
Thank you. No speaking. No praising the self while disparaging others. Not indulging in anger. That involves both speech and behavior. And speaking of the faults of others, the gossip. So Buddhism has developed an ethics of speech that's much more refined than the monotheisms. And I asked Aitken Roshi about this, why this came to be, and he said that actually in the culture that surrounded the Buddha's lifetime, that there was a very strong Hindu and even Zoroastrian concern with what was called gentle speech. So not only not telling falsehoods, but not being harsh, striving for the ideal of gentle speech. So that was already in the worldview that the Buddha lived in. One of the things that many of us who first started practicing Buddhism got involved with was 2 of the 8-fold paths, meditation and mindfulness. Those were the things, the 1/4 of the 8 that caught our attention, that looked kind of mystical and that we liked the aesthetics of, and that places like this were formed so people could sit. Yet, many of us forgot the other 6 elements of the 8-fold path. And that's why I think it's important to go back and look at things like right livelihood, right speech, and so on. Now, but there is a relationship between speech and mindfulness, and between speech and meditation. There's something very wonderful about, just a few minutes ago, about the silence in here for half an hour. The silence of 30 people in a room. Yet, if we really had a way in to people's heads, we would realize that this room was not so silent. There would be 30 little yakking going on. So this is where we can start with the practice of right speech, is noticing the thoughts, the internal speech that goes on during our sitting meditation, our walking meditation, or throughout the day. Just like in much of insight meditation practice, noticing is the first step. Noticing the track of those thoughts through our minds is step 1. You don't have to do anything about them, just notice. And one of the things I started noticing when I wanted to focus on right speech is how negative many of my thoughts are about myself and about other people. Constant. So then there's the next step. Notice and then approach it and see if you can change it. I don't think change happens until you accept where you are in the first place. So the noticing is very important. But I started trying to use some Vipassana methods to actively change how I was thinking, which in my theory would also help me change how I would speak later in other parts of my life. And there are many Vipassana things that are helpful, but I sort of distilled one of them, which is when anyone, this is in, or a version of it's in Sharon Salzberg's book, Loving Kindness. Whenever I think negatively of someone, whether I'm sitting zazen or driving or sitting at a desk, I try and stop myself and say this formula. May he or she, may he be safe. It's 4-part. May he be safe. May he be healthy. May he be happy. May he awaken. Now that gets pretty tedious, especially when I notice it most driving. Someone cuts in front of you, and my first thing is, you son of a, and so on and so forth. And so I try and stop myself and say, may he be safe, may he be healthy, may he be happy, may he wake up. But I don't think he will. And if I do that, then I have to start over. That's my agreement until it disappears, until the negativity really goes away. Well, this starts taking up a lot of your time when you start doing this, and it's amazing if you really do it every time you think negatively, and do it with yourself too. But it starts changing things. First you notice, and then you start counteracting the negativity. Now, one of the questions I was trying to address in the chapter in Queer Dharma 2 was, where are we in the gay community about speech? Do we have a more difficult time with this than other people? And that's probably still an open question. I kind of avoided answering it. But I think we do have certain problems with speech. If we look at gay speech, campy speech, speech that marks us as a group, that is part of our culture, one of the things with gay men, at least, we notice is the many negative stereotypes of women that come into our speech indirectly. When we say, oh, I'm such a dizzy bitch, or I'm such a slut, or she's such a whore. All those words, bitch, whore, slut, are pointing toward the female, but pointing toward the negative aspects of femininity. We don't seem to point toward the positive stereotypes. You know, I'm so sensitive and long-suffering and flexible and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting thing, the problem we have. And I think it needs some looking at, although I have no particular answers about that, because I like campy speech. I think it's fun. Yet, we got to look at it, I think. The other thing I point out in that chapter is that I think sharp, harsh speech is kind of valued in the gay community. I notice when I come back here in the Castro, or when I'm in New York, in the village, that every gay waiter, every gay clerk in a bookstore really is trying to be as clever as they can and loud and kind of proving to everyone how campy and clever they can be. And it's a value that we instill in young gay men trying to get into our community. The faster you are with your tongue in comebacks or put-downs or sharp speech, the better. The better you'll do, the better you'll defend yourself. So I think there is something in our community that encourages speech that isn't very gentle sometimes. And even it seems to be a real value. Even gay men who have very poor education still are amazingly verbally skillful. So it's something we teach and we expect of each other. So that's something I think we need to question and look at a bit. The other question is gossip. One definition of gossip is telling things about someone that you do not know to be true. That's one definition that was used in our precept study in Diamond Sangha. And that's a pretty good starting point. But it may be a little more complicated than that. What if you tell something that you do know to be true about someone, but it's negative? So there's where we start looking at the other things the sutras say about speech. Speech that's harsh, speech that's idle. Is there a reason to pass on very true bad news about someone else? Sometimes there is a reason, I think, to help someone understand a third person. So maybe in those situations. But I find this problem of gossip one of the hardest things for me to behave with. It's hard. It's for me not to repeat something that I've heard that's juicy. It takes I squirm and sweat with the effort of not saying it. And I don't know why that's so hard. I don't know why I want to spread this bad news. It's very hard. Now, if someone tells me, don't say this to anyone, then I don't have a problem with that. I can keep that pretty well. And that, actually, that's a very good skill to have. I know 2 people in my circle of friends who I would never tell anything I didn't want spread. I just have to watch myself with those 2 particular people. They can't help it. Whatever I can't take their inventory, as they say in 12-step programs. But for whatever reason, those 2 people have both said to me many, many times, I'm not supposed to say this, but, and they go on. And so that's my warning flag right there. If you have to swear anyone to secrecy, then you probably better not tell that person what you want them to be secret about, if you have to go through that formality. But a person who can keep secrets or confidences is very valuable in any, especially in small communities, whether that's a work situation or a sangha or a neighborhood. When you can go to a person and that what you say to them will not move on, that person's a gem. So that's a case where silence is part of right speech. When to be quiet. I've learned from Polynesians and Asians that there are other subtleties about speech. For instance, I was talking to a Hawaiian friend of mine a few weeks ago, and he said, we were talking about his teenage son who was sort of acting out. And I said, well, you better talk to him about that, what he was doing. And Robert said, yeah, I will, but I'll wait until we're in the car going somewhere. In that culture, in Hawaiian culture, you would never pull someone aside and say, now sit down, I want to talk to you about something. That marks the situation as too direct and too almost assaultive. But Robert knew that if he was in the car driving with his son, and I found this to be true too, you can talk about a lot of things. First of all, the other person can't escape. The other advantage is you're both sort of looking in the same direction, and his son can look out the other window and kind of... and it seems a casual situation, too. It's not marked with a great deal of anxiety. So he was being very wise in his own culture about how to time this. Americans are, we're really trained badly to believe that we have the right to say anything we want, whenever we want, and that's the bottom line of freedom. And maybe it is, but it's not the bottom line of good judgment. So timing can be an important thing when you say something. Context can be important, how you say something, what your surroundings are when you say it. So speech starts getting very complicated when you get into it as a practice. I was talking to a guy in our Sangha who's an attorney, and that's a whole other realm of right speech or wrong. And he said when Aitken Roshi has us write out the 10 great precepts in our own way, and so that when we take refuge ceremony or jukai, when we take on the 10 precepts, we take them on in our own words. So this guy told me, we were kind of debating whether to talk stink about someone. Talk stink is a Hawaiian pidgin word for gossiping or being negative about someone. I've always enjoyed that phrase. So Doug said, well, when I took my jukai ceremony, I wrote this precept as, I will always discuss other people as if they were with me in the room. So I thought, well, that's a good way of thinking about it. And so we went on to discuss this person with him very carefully deciding what he would be willing to say in front of that person. And we kept it at that. It's another tactic, it's another strategy. At the end of the Koan series in our lineage, which emphasizes Koan study, when a person has gone through the Koan curriculum, at the end of that, they are given 10 more koan, and that's the 10 great precepts. So that they're asked to work with the precepts as if it was a koan, to do it during their meditation, to turn them over and over in their mind, looking at each facet of the koan, of the puzzle. So that's sort of what I suggest in general terms, and how I've tried to deal with it as practice. Keep looking at it. Keep looking at all the facets. Keep turning that precept around and around. Because I think it's it's one of the most important ones. It's as important as meditation. It's as important as mindfulness. It's as important as right livelihood. And it has effects if you change how you speak. I say in that chapter, one of the people in our Sangha told Roshi, he was a copy editor in a daily paper in Honolulu. He told Roshi, I just can't get in, to sit every morning at the dojo, but I'm going to try right speech in my workplace, because this city newsroom was just a viper's nest of gossip and put-downs and so on. And so he started this just by refraining from participating in the gossip, just by not passing it on, not lecturing people, not scolding people for gossiping, just pulling out of it, just avoiding it, just not continuing it. And after a year or so, he said he looked at the situation in his office, and it had much improved. Slowly people had gotten the idea that at least in this part of the office, with this person, it didn't fly, this negative speech about others. So it can have really good consequences, cause and effect. And its speech is a combination of behavior and thought. Speech is the behavior of thought. So it's right at the center of both our meditation and our daily lives. And that's one reason why I think it's a really important focus of practice. Where am I time? Okay. I think we have some time for questions, if any of you bitches want to ask. Sorry, I slipped. That was one of my biggest fears about giving this talk, is can I get through it without violating right speech? So please, any of your experience or, yes?
I've been part of a small group, a precepts group, that is met once a month for 4 years maybe. And even though it's only once a month, which seems hardly adequate, it nevertheless has given me a focus to be able to both confront myself and look at possibly skillful ways of dealing with what my experience is. And sadly enough, I have come to understand that sometimes, more than sometimes, it happens. I will say things, and only afterwards will it become clear to me, and that perhaps what I need to do is, and I've made a practice out of this, of learning what the feelings of the mind states are afterwards when I've done it. Because I'm aware that all sorts of things arise in me after I've done it. I'm not comfortable. And so what I've elected to do is to leave space afterwards. And oftentimes I have gone up to people because I've not really felt I had a choice to apologize for things that I've done either directly with them or in their absence. And what's interesting to me is that people have responded to me and said, "Oh, you don't need to do that. It's all right." And then I have to acknowledge that a very important component is that I'm doing it for myself, so that I will not be the same person. So that it isn't just getting their forgiveness or their witnessing of what I've done, just allowing myself to hold that consciousness so that it's part of the process. Right speech is really, for me personally, just too difficult to think that I am going to be able beforehand.
Yeah, you're making a very good point, which is how to repair this the consequences of our actions.
Just for instance, where you said somebody, two friends who gossip, and when I would say, I was not supposed to say it, but it came to my mind immediately that the listener gossip just as well as the one who says things. Because the moment you say, don't tell me, just don't tell me. And then you're out of that whole realm of their understanding you don't like it. Because I teach at a college, and students love to gossip about teachers. And there's something I just make very clear. I don't discuss teachers with students, period. I don't like that gossip. But I must say, we talk about right speech, I do have that snappiness sometimes. That kind of all about Eve, Betty Davis, snappy.
You're dating yourself.
So I have to be very careful with that, especially with students, and sometimes, I can just hit out with like a snake, and it's not something I like very much, period. So I work on that every day I work on that.
Yeah, good.
I have a question. Thank you for your comments. They were very helpful. I spend a lot of time in a number of different Buddhist groups, and right speech is something that I'm beginning to work much more on. And I'm finding that I think part of my experience that I'm going to describe is a bit defensive on my part, but nonetheless it's a problem for me. I wondered if you had any comments. It seems to me that in these groups that I have a problem with speaking too much and speaking directly, not in a conscious way, too directly, and at times. And I feel like the rules of a lot of Buddhist groups are, I can think about a meeting I was at recently, a prolonged board meeting, and that things like silence is okay, don't say harsh things, and it was reflected in some of what you were saying. It's like what not to do. But the other side of the issue of how to responsibly bring things up doesn't seem to be focused on. And the way you presented the precepts also comes across as don't gossip, don't lie, don't be angry. And there's not much emphasis on what to do, how to be responsible in one's speech, how to bring things up. Do you have any reflections on that?
First of all, I think that at least Americans are much better at bringing things up on their own without much encouragement. It's part of our culture. So I don't think that's our big problem. But I agree about...
That's not my experience in these groups. The tendency would be much more for people. I agree with you about American culture. But in these groups, it seems like to not bring things up is valued. That's how I hear it. I say there's a defensive part.
Yeah, okay. So as sort of just smooth it over, whitewash something.
Don't bring it up in the first place.
Yeah. Well, that's a hard one. Is this crucial? Is this important enough that it has to be brought up? Is it better for the harmony of the group that it's not discussed right now? Those are all difficult questions, and I don't have an answer. I think you've got to get a feel for the circumstances and the group itself, what it can do without throwing things at each other, without getting to that point. It's probably very common, I don't know, Thich Nhat Hanh's group, and we've adopted it also, is the mindfulness bell, this small bell when we're meeting as a Sangha to decide various things. People get, they have strong opinions and are very attached to their own version of reality. And so actually, I was going to say when things heat up, but it's also all through the group. Someone will hit the bell every once in a while, and everything stops, and everyone just goes silent, and you take 3 deep breaths. And it's to pull people back, remind us of the silence. The other thing, I agree with your comment about it sounds too negative. Don't do this, don't do that. The thing I forgot to mention is that the flip side of speech is listening. And that's not taught in any religion. Most religions teach their adherents how to proselytize, how to convert, how to give sermons or homilies or dharma talks. So there's lots of training in how to speak, but not in how to listen. And that's where the Dalai Lama's concept, and it's a Vipassana concept also, in Tibetan, of enemy yoga. Let's say there's a faction in this room and a faction over here. Can this faction be quiet and listen to what they say as if they were not the enemy, as if they had a valid point? I mentioned in the chapter the issue of abortion. Stance on abortion has very good arguments on both sides of it. But if you say that, you're already in trouble. You know, it's so hot that the sides will not listen to each other. And yet, there's a very good logic on each side of that question. Listening is another big, important thing. And how to shut up your own mind, your own thoughts long enough to really listen to someone. Or, and this is more compassion practice, how to listen to someone that you don't care for, who's boring, who's, whatever your judgment of them is, without looking at your watch, without making an excuse to get out the door. We all have people like that in our lives. So that's another way of being generous, is listening with generosity. Yeah.
One of the things with listening as well, though, I find myself caught in situations where I'm listening to people bitch and moan or talk really negatively to other people. And, that's such a mindfulness thing too, because it's so easy to just get caught up and then boy, that upright speech, falls apart completely, because you don't want to have empathy with the other person, and you don't want to get into proselytizing and saying, I can't listen to this because it'll start, whatever. But it's that I find a big challenge too.
Yeah, there is a good argument sometimes for avoidance, Thich Nhat Hanh says this, for instance: if your anger level is too high to deal with the situation without violating right speech, then probably the best thing is to leave, walk out, get out of the situation, and come back to it when you're able to speak with more open flexibility, with more compassion. That doesn't solve the situation of, how do you scold others, but at least you're making a point by leaving. I talk about a situation where I was arguing with a neighbor of ours who had a dog who was barking day and night, and she started. She turned the situation around and started complaining about us, the cult next door, and you have people coming and going at all times of the day and night, and that's why the dog's barking. And I was so furious. And she talked about, there had been a peeping Tom in her window once, and all this. And the thought that kept going through my head as I'm standing there at the fence is, you paranoid bitch. Paranoid. I just had to stop myself. I stood there like a dummy. In some ways I felt like that, with this thought in my head, but I didn't say it. And I turned and I walked away. Because I couldn't have dealt with it then, without saying that phrase that was in my head. And every time I still hear her dog bark, I have to do the metta formula, May she be safe. May she be happy. May she be healthy. May she wake up. but I don't think she will. And her little dog, too. Yeah.
I did this workshop a few weekends ago called The Art of Talking and Listening, and it was put on by a couple of Buddhist teachers in the East Bay. And there were a lot of couples there, and what really amazed all of us at this workshop was that the amount of concepts that we carry around with us and we put out in almost everything we say, like our own very own concepts that we are constantly putting out there in what we're saying. No matter how objective we think we're being, we're putting out these layers upon layers of concepts that we are carrying around. And it, I don't know, it really blew us all away, especially the couples were like uncovering things that they had never seen about each other. And I was blown away at the things that I was uncovering about things, the concepts that I was carrying around.
Yeah. And we're very attached to our concepts and can't understand why everyone doesn't think that way.
Yeah.
Time?
No.
Oh. Yeah.
I always think about right speech as being why the Buddha put such an emphasis on it is that it's sort of a miraculous power. It's like telekinesis. I mean, across a room, like you say, you can project your concepts, your prejudices, your thought forms, even things that appear to be solid and great, and a gift. You've got to be careful about what you're giving because it's going directly into somebody's brain and nervous system and reformulating it across the room. I mean, it's a miraculous power. And humans have used this power in gossiping, they're trying to form alliances. Who's with me on this idea? Who's the enemy here? Any kind of proselytizing is the same thing. You're trying to form social.
Well, I think it's gossip and proselytizing too involve self and other, distinguishing. Those people are just, white trash or, trailer trash, but I'm not. Much of gossip is involved with that dynamic, I think. And proselytizing is, I'm saved and you're not. More separation. That's the other thing I didn't mention about meditation. The other action that's going on is we start to really understand or to experience this self and other is not real. That we are the other. That there is no enemy except ourselves. And we're also the friend. So the distinction between self and other, if that starts to evaporate, it also means you no longer have to defend yourself with sharp words or with a feeling of I'm better than you are. You're trash and I'm not.
Just one other thing I want to finish was that addressing the idea of concentrating on the not the negative aspects of don't, but also what can one do to enlighten other beings by one's speech? It's the same doorway is open. Anything can pass through that doorway.
Yeah, you're right. Speech is and can be magical and beautiful and powerful. So it has all those positive elements.
I just want to say one of the things that has been really helpful to me is to try to always be aware of the illusion of my separate self, and that I'm somehow unchanging. Because if I'll like hear something that I perhaps don't like, someone saying or the way they're acting, I think, maybe about 15 years ago I was acting the same way and saying exactly the same thing, and I'm not at the end of my path yet too. I might, and that's been very helpful with me, is just to not see that separation there anymore.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on something you said at the very beginning of your talk, and that's that you can't change until you know where you're at. Because that sort of sticks with me, because that process, I won't say you glossed over it, your lecture was about right speech, but before one can focus on one aspect, the aspect that's troubling you the most in the Eightfold Path, there is that process of noticing who you are.
It's a real paradox, and I think there's even, in the therapy literature, there's even some research that supports this concept of people do not change until they fully accept their current situation. You do not become a non-smoker if you deny the fact that you're a smoker. You have to fully accept that issue, that problem, that whatever you want to call it, before moving on to change. And it's a paradox. It's like you've got to love your problem before you can say goodbye to it. You have to know it. You have to be a connoisseur of your own folly.
We were saying this morning very quickly that in order to do that in a way, in order to become really conversant with yourself, it required, Howard, get me if I'm wrong, it required a sort of naivete or idealism, some courage, and some fear. And that sort of resonated with me. Mm-hmm. Time, too. You haven't brought that up, but,
It takes a long time. Yeah.
It has to do with denial, facing your denial of what you don't want to change.
Right. Yeah.
We're coming up on the hour. Can we maybe just take a couple more questions?
I just have a quick, hopefully quick issue about speech, the many different levels of it and complexity, and how it is hard to address what's being talked to. Sometimes what the words are, the actual things that are being talked about, have nothing to do with what the actual intent of the speaker really. And so how do you, and you gave a really good example with that lady next to you, where she was saying specific situations, saying people are peeking at me, that people come at weird hours at night, and so the actual facts you put forth were like, well, when you address those facts, are people peeking? Is her tranquility being disturbed by people coming? But that wasn't the case. The case was she felt she was being made wrong, so her response was to make you wrong, and that happens all the time. And it's really hard to hear somebody who brings up specific issues and points when you know that that's not what's behind the speech. Behind the speech is a totally different agenda. It's either to make a person wrong or to make another person wrong. It's like ego defense. Yeah. So how do you listen to, in a situation like that, how do you listen to the conversation where points are being made, where you strongly suspect that these points are not relevant, that there's another point that's not being addressed at all behind that?
The only thing I would say about that is that it depends on your role. If I were her therapist, then I would say, tell me more about these peeping toms, or I would explore what's gone wrong here, and what is evasive or false about her speech. But I wasn't in that role, and I was also angry, so I couldn't do much except save myself from whatever her denials or rationalizations were. I couldn't address that. And that's, that's another problem in disputes, is wanting to win, wanting to prove that the other person is mistaken or off track. That's a very difficult thing to give up. To want to have the last word. Couples are very good at this. It's just it's a game. Who gets to shout the last insult before the door slams? Even if we think we know what that other person is doing, it's to our benefit to know that, but we may not be able to control their knowing that. And we just have to give that up sometimes. There are other situations where, you can be more direct and address it, I think.
I'm fascinated and always have been with just the poetries of oppressed peoples. And the gay speech is just so wonderful in its uses for both defense and attack. And I think now, especially coming from positions of 1999, we can begin to learn a new poetry. We can begin to learn the poetry of friendship and love as against the poetry of bitchery, which has supported us for so long.
It's a good way to end. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.